Good evening. It is good to be with you here. Already Jana and Jenna have rolled out the red carpet and just wonderful warm hospitality, a delicious supper, and it's so good to catch up with Jana. It's really a blessing. It's also a blessing to be able to spend this evening and tomorrow morning talking about one of the greatest gifts that God has ever given us, the gift of children. And as already been said this evening, it's a powerful gift. If we want to affect the future, it's up to parents. If we want to affect the future of the Lord's kingdom, it's up to parents. If we want to affect society and culture, it's up to parents. But it's not simply and only up to parents. You see, every one of us here, we have the ability to invest in other children's lives, other than our own children. We have the opportunity, whether it's in Bible classes or teaching in school systems, or if it's just having a tremendous influence on a neighbor that lives beside us or across the road. I hope that some of the things that we look at tonight and tomorrow, that we realize that the effect can be far greater than just maybe a biological child that God has placed into our hands. In just a few minutes, we'll be getting to Psalm 127. If you want to turn there, we'll look at that in just a few minutes. I like Bill Cosby's sketch that he does on children. Of course, it's not biblically accurate. And of course, I can't tell it with any kind of humor like Bill can. His facial expressions alone can draw more laughs than I could ever in anything that I could try to do. And so I don't offer this to you in any kind of competitiveness with him and comical value, but it is something just to think about of where did this all start? This whole idea of parenting, where did it all start? Well, God made His first two children, Adam and Eve, and He placed them in a beautiful home that He had created for them. And as He did, He gave them some instruction. And part of the instruction that He gave them is He explained to them, I don't want you to eat of that tree that is in the middle of the garden. Don't eat of its fruit. And about the time He's explaining that, now keep in mind, this is Bill Cosby's rendition, okay? About the time He's explaining that, Adam elbows Eve and says, Eve, did you hear that? We have forbidden fruit. And about that time, God emphasizes, that's right, forbidden. Don't eat of it. And he tries to make that as clear as he can, and a little bit frustrated with the fact that they seem excited about it. He turns away thinking to himself, maybe I should have stopped creation after I made the elephants, but he didn't. And so then in a few minutes he turns and comes back to his first two children, and what are they doing? They're having a forbidden fruit break. And surprised at that, he looks over and he says to his first son, Adam, what are you doing? And like most sons would say in that situation, he said, And he looks over at Eve and he says, Eve, what are you doing? And she says, like a daughter would say, I don't know. And then he goes back to Adam. And he says, Adam, why did you do that? And he said, she made me do it. And then, like a sibling would do, except we know they're not siblings, but anyway, like another child would do, she looks over and says, did not? And he says, did too? Did not, did too. And so they play that game that parents have hated for their children to play ever since then. And finally God says, be quiet. I want to punish you, but I have to figure out what it's going to be. So just sit in silence and let me think for a moment. God sits in silence and He thinks, and then the slyest grin comes to His face. And then He speaks up and He says, I know what I'll do. I'll give you children of your own. And that's how children came about, according to Bill Cosby. Now, we see the humor in it, but also we see the fallacy in it. Children are not a punishment from God. Instead, when we read in Psalm 127, we see in verse 1 that we need to allow the Lord to build our house. And that's what we're going to be talking about this weekend, is we want to allow God to build us. and to create us as parents. And in that, we can help create our children into what God wants them to be. And so skipping down to verse 3, children are a punishment to parents. But look at verse 3. Behold, children are a heritage from the Lord. The fruit of the womb is a reward. Like arrows in the hand of a warrior, so are the children of one's youth. Happy is the man who has his quiver full of them. They shall not be ashamed, but they shall speak with their enemies in the gate. I love that description. There are some very strong descriptions here. He uses the word heritage. Usually we think of the word heritage of one generation blessing or prospering another generation. And in this case, it's God blessing us with the next generation. And he says it's the fruit of the womb. Fruit, we usually think of something productive, something positive. What good would it be to be a farmer and have no productivity, have no harvest, have no fruit? And so here he's using very positive language to say, I'm giving children to you. They're like a heritage that I'm giving to you, an inheritance that I'm giving. They're like fruit. They're like a harvest that I'm giving to you. And then, even to say something that in our culture today probably doesn't make sense, but in their culture it would have made great sense. He says, it's like a soldier going into battle. Imagine the day when a soldier was going into battle, and maybe a particular soldier, pretty much all that he had for his weapon was a bow and an arrow. Who's going to be the soldier that feels a little bit more prepared for battle? The man that looks down at his quiver that holds his arrows and only sees one or two? Or the man that looks down at his quiver and it is full of arrows? That's why he says there, happy is the man who has his quiver full of them. In other words, he's just painting this picture to say, children are a wonderful gift. And the man that can look over and he can see several children is a man that should have and realize he has a very bountiful gift from God. Perhaps no one here needs to be reminded of how wonderful the gift is of children. But because we live in a culture that does not place the highest value upon children, I think maybe it would be good for us to begin tonight and to pause here and just stop here for a moment and think about the fact children are a tremendous value. Our culture tends to place a value upon those who can produce. And because of that, oftentimes the ones that are neglected or overlooked are the ones on each end of life. Who's going to speak up for the young ones who do not have a voice? Who's going to wait upon and care and speak up for the ones that are aged and cannot take care of themselves? Listen, it's God who teaches you and I, different from a world that does not have a God that they listen to. Our God teaches us the value of life. Our God teaches us the value of life beginning with the very beginning of life, saying it's not that they're a gift once they get old enough and they can be productive in society. Children are a gift from the very, very beginning. Everybody here that has a child can probably remember the feeling and the emotion the first time, the first baby of yours, not saying the second and third is not important, but there's something about the first time that firstborn is placed in your arms. And everybody here would probably have some way you would describe that. Fearful, excited, amazed, the heavy weight of responsibility, concern for the unknown. I've never done this before. I can't predict the future. What do I do? Oh, it's just interesting to hear what people thought and what they felt the first time they held their firstborn. our firstborn, as already mentioned, Colton, he was born to us while we lived just a few years on the end of Long Island, New York. We lived in a town called Riverhead, but he was actually born in the Southampton Hospital. And Southampton the hospital was a small hospital. It's only about 3 stories tall. And when we went there to kind of take a tour of it before we went there to actually Tracy give birth, one of the things that they told us was, you're going to love this hospital. Because it's so small, you get pampered because there's usually no more than 1 mother, and at the most 2 at a time. And so you have all these nurses that just dote over your baby and they just take care of you. And that's kind of our specialty here at Southampton. And so you're going to love the experience of giving birth here. Well, Colton was born in the wee hours of the morning of a full moon. And so when we made that 35-mile drive there, and by the time we got to the hospital, which is kind of an interesting story that we won't take the time now, but we were ready to have a baby. It was time. And what we found when we walked in was there were women giving babies all over that hospital. This was back in the ancient days where you had a labor room and a delivery room and a recovery room, and then finally the room that you went in afterwards. And so as we're checking in, they're literally saying, we don't know if we have a labor room. We don't know. And then finally someone spoke up and said, that one just opened up. You can go in that room. And we went in a room that wasn't even bigger than a closet. And she laid down there, and in just a matter of a few minutes, you know, she's saying, I can't stay here long. I'm about to have this baby. And what do we know about having babies, right? First one for each of us. And so they're busy as can be. And finally I step out in the hall and I stop this nurse and I say to the nurse, I say, look, I know you're busy, but can you please just check her real quick? I think we need to move on. And so the nurse checks her and of course says, whoa, we got to have a baby here. Well, there's only 2 delivery rooms. One just happened to free up. They rolled her right across the hall, but there's only 1 crew delivering. So they take the crew that's in delivering this baby because this baby isn't coming as quick, and they shift over and they deliver Colton. And they kind of clean him up a little bit, and they swat him up in a cloth, and the nurse looks around at me. I'm the youngest in my family. I'm over 1,000 miles from home. And she turns around at me and she says, can you hold him for a while? We've got to go deliver the other baby. Well, my wife's kind of there on that cold delivery room table, kind of passed out. And I'm sitting on the stool. And Colton and I just began looking at each other for about the next 45 minutes to an hour. And you couldn't pay me anything to take those moments away. Wow. The thoughts, the feelings, the prayers, the wondering, what if, what's it going to be like? That first hour of his life was such a special gift. But that's what God said. God says to us as parents, I'm giving you a heritage. I'm giving you a reward for me. I'm giving you something that should be a tremendous blessing to you. And no matter what society tells us, I want to encourage you to remember that that is God's view of the gift of children. That it is just that. It's not a punishment. It's a reward. It's something very, very special. And with that in mind, we think about the very fact that parenting truly should be viewed as a journey. Because what we also know when we're parenting, and you know, I don't know how many times I've stood in the grocery store line, and I don't know how it is here in Missouri, I really don't, but I'll tell you how it is in the South. You stand in the grocery store line with your little ones stacked up there, and about every other month, somebody in the grocery store line is going to say to you, hey, you enjoy those years, you turn around twice and they're going to be gone. Well, you know what? They were right. See, parenting is never a stationary position. Parenting is all about a journey. And so with that in mind, I want you to think with me throughout this tonight. What journey are we on? What journey is it that God has given us as He is the one that designed parents? You see, God designed children to need parents. And so we know one thing. We know that God didn't design any bad children. And so when we see little children that are doing bad things, it's generally because of poor parenting. And I know that children can reach an age where they have to make decisions for themselves, and then they can decide to rebel. If we didn't believe that, we believe in once saved, always saved. But while they're younger, it's usually much more often a reflection of the parents than children, because God didn't make bad children. And so we say, well, what is this journey that God has designed? Because if we can walk step in step with God, what a difference we can make in the lives of our children. And we'll go ahead and throw this out, and I hope I say this another time or two over the hours we spend together. Anything we say about good parenting, we need to make sure that our goal is to be good parents, but never so we can be bragged upon or we can brag upon ourselves. Good parenting is so that we can move our children closer to God. We want to excel at parenting. But nobody here needs to get a dislocated elbow so they can pat themselves on the back and they can wear a button, the best dad of the year, the best mom of the year. It's not about us being in competition with other parents. Look, my children are performing better than your children. Listen, if anything that I say paints that kind of picture, I assure you, you're misunderstanding what I'm hoping that we learn and study together. But if you get the idea from what we learn and study together, that parenting is important, and that we ought to give our all to succeed at it. Absolutely. We ought to set out for our children's sake and for the kingdom's sake to be the best parents we possibly could ever be. What would that look like? Let's go back to the beginning. Let's go back and not see Bill Cosby's rendition. Let's go back and see how it really was and what God said. In Genesis, the first chapter, God said, verse 26, Genesis 1 and 26. Then God said, let us make man in our image. Isn't that interesting that the Godhead is referring to themselves as our here? You realize that before man was ever made, God, the Father, the Son, and the Spirit were experiencing relationship. Relationships didn't start just when man came along. What we enjoy in relationship was a reflection of the Creator who made us. God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness. Let them have dominion over the fish of the sea, over the birds of the air, over the cattle, over all the earth, over every creeping thing that creeps upon the earth. So God created man in His own image. In the image of God, He created him, male and female. He created them. What is the image? Well, we know from John 4, God is a spirit. So the very idea to say, well, He must have made us like Him, maybe 2 feet and 2 hands and stands upright. I doubt He's talking about any physical characteristic when He says, let's make man after our image. Probably what He is talking about is at least 2 things that we can see from this chapter, and there's probably a lot of other ways that we don't even know about until He reveals to us when He comes again. But one is the very fact that He made us different from the animals, because He breathed into us the breath of life. Look down to the 2nd chapter and verse 7, speaking again about creating us, Genesis 2 and 7. And the Lord God formed man of the dust of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Listen, the elephant was a living being. The dog's a living being. The cat's a living being. You just look at all the animals, they're living. What's different about all the animals and then about man and woman? What's different? When He made the human race, He breathed into their nostrils the breath of life, and that life is the very idea of a soul. The second thing we've already mentioned, from here down to the end of this chapter, the language is very strong about relationship. He made man to share in relationship. You notice there in verse 18, and the Lord God said, it's not good. We're in the second chapter. It's not good that man should be what? Alone. Why? God wanted man to have relationships. So notice what He's going to do. I'll make him a helper comparable to him. And then, of course, the rest of this chapter tells about how Eve was created. And they're going to have the relationship of companionship, of marriage together. But you see what's happening here is that what is so different from us and the animals? We have a soul and we have the ability to share in deep, meaningful relationships that animals can't share in those. I get it that relationships to some degree can exist in the animal kingdom, and then many of us have pets that we love dearly, that we have some form of relationship with, but the idea to put an animal relationship on the same depth of a human or humans' relationships with each other just isn't accurate. The ability to share in each other's life, the ability to communicate, the ability to lift up each other, to build each other up, the ability to look beyond this earth. Listen, all of these things are things that we have the ability to do in relationships with other human beings. So what did God do? If we want to really grasp some of the deep-rooted importance of parenting, we need to go back to the beginning. When God placed that child in a womb and in our arms, He placed a child that will never cease to exist. That's sobering. I think about a man who told me one time, he said, when our firstborn was born, he said, my wife and I were very faithful Christians. We understood the gift that God had given to us, we thought. And he said, but the preacher came by and visited us in the hospital. And said, before he left, he said, could I have a prayer with you guys? I said, sure, we'd love that. And said, as he prayed, he said something to the effect, in thanking God for this child that you have placed within a soul that will never cease to exist. And then he prayed for the parents that they would guide that soul toward eternity. That man told me about 11 years after that. He said, I have never forgotten that prayer. He said, if you would have asked me, did you know that before? I said, well, sure, I know that. But he said, it's just that heavy burden and realization whenever you're there in the hospital with your firstborn and you realize a soul has been placed in our care that will never cease to exist. The soul of that child will spend an eternity somewhere. And who can have a tremendous impact upon that? Well, God gives children parents. And parents are the one that's to have the huge impact upon that. Do you remember that situation with David? If you want to skip over to 2 Samuel, the 12th chapter, do you remember when David was in that dark period of his life? And you remember he's committed the sin of adultery. He's had Bathsheba's husband killed. And now, probably at least 9 months, maybe a year goes by, and for whatever strange reason, he's not feeling the guilt of it. So God sends Nathan, and Nathan comes to him, and he tells him that story about a rich man that has all kinds of sheep, and then across the road is a poor man that only has one little female lamb. And this man has a guest to stop in, and instead of taking one of his many sheep, he goes across the road and gets this man's only lamb, and he slays it. And he serves it to feed to a stranger. And David is so upset about it. Notice what he says there at the end of verse 5. As the Lord lives, the man who has done this shall surely die. And then notice the boldness in the 7th verse of 2 Samuel 12. Then Nathan said to David, you are the man. And it was from there that David's heart was broken. It's from there that we believe that he wrote Psalm 51, begging God to forgive him, confessing against you and you only have I sinned, and created me a clean heart, O God. Beautiful, beautiful words all through a broken and a contrite heart. wanting restoration with God. But you realize and remember that the rest of this chapter is where he also is told by Nathan, part of the punishment that God is going to give you is that your child is going to die. Oh, and David begins to fast. He begins to lie down and pray. And the servants are so concerned over him. And then finally, when he sees them whispering, he asks the condition of the child. He's told that the child has died. David then gets up, cleans up, he begins to eat, and the servants are confused. What's this? When the child was alive, you mourn, and now that the child is deceased, you're up and about? That doesn't make sense to us. And David explains, my fasting and my prayer was for the child to live, but now that the child hasn't lived, I can't. Well, let's let him say it. This is very important. We're going to read 22 and 23, the last two verses of 2 Samuel 12. And he said, while the child was alive, I fasted and wept. For I said, who can tell whether the Lord will be gracious to me that the child might live? But now he is dead. Why should I fast? Notice this. Can I bring him back again? I shall go to him, but he shall not return to me. Listen, David wasn't being heartless. David still loved that baby as much as he loved the baby when he's alive. So David, what are you saying? David is pointing out two things that every parent here would do well to remember. One is every child is on a journey that leads to a destination. We need to think about which journey our children are on. Because every journey has a destination. But then the second thing that he said, I realize this. Once they've passed through that journey, there's no coming back. Once we die, there's no coming back. Once we pass through childhood, there's no coming back. Every journey has a destination, and no journey allows you to ever take one step back in life. That mother that she's so happy that her child is 3 and she doesn't have to have the terrible twos anymore. She's exactly right. You won't ever have one more day out of that child of terrible twos. You're right. And believe it or not, there'll be some days that you'll just wish you could have a few of them back. But you won't. And that day that you're running the 12 and 13-year-old all over for here and pick them up there and drive them here, and you feel more like a taxi than a parent, and you just think, when's this ever going to end? Oh, it's going to end. Not only is it going to end, it won't ever come back. And you might be surprised one day you'll actually miss some of that. But you know what? It won't come back. Whenever your child leaves home, and you think to yourself, I never studied Scripture much with my child. I didn't pray with my child like I should have. There were some of the ways in which I lived before my child. I didn't model faith. And you'll wish you could go back. But you won't. There's never a step back. We raise our children once, and there's no do-overs. And so it's interesting when we think about this journey. And it's almost in Genesis 1 that we get this picture that says, look, I don't want to just tell you as a human race your beginning. I want to tell you your beginning and what you're moving toward. If you were just a dog or a cat or a cow, just live some kind of life, because it doesn't matter. After you breathe your last, there's no more. But he's telling us, I made you different. I made your children different. I breathed into them a soul. When their physical body is no more, what is really them, their soul, is never going to cease. So what's the message? I'd like for you to look with me to Matthew the 16th chapter. In Matthew the 16th chapter is a passage that I need to hear as a parent, and I need to confront it. I need to face it face to face and be honest with myself. You remember, this is a rich passage where the verses right before, we're about to read verse 26, but remember the paragraph right before that is where Jesus tried to prepare Peter and the apostles that he was headed to Jerusalem and there he was going to die. And Peter, he's thinking earthly here. Well, what would you do for an earthly friend? Hey, if I could step between them and death, I'd try to save them. And so he's thinking purely human here. And he said, oh no, Lord, far be it from you. I won't let this thing happen. Remember, that's where Jesus looks at him and says, get behind me, Satan. Why? The very purpose for Jesus being on this earth was going to the cross. And now one of his friends is stopping him from his purpose. And so now he accuses his friend of being influenced by Satan. Remember the end of that in 23? He turned and he said to Peter, get behind me, Satan. You are an offense to me. Why? For you are not mindful of the things of God, but of the things of man. When we're raising our children, I want you to really dwell on this. And I don't mean just right now. I want you to take this with you and think on this. What are we mindful of when we're raising our children? We only get one journey. And if we do it right, whatever influence we have, I realize when our children get to be older, they have to make their decision. And we can raise them up to point them in the right direction. And if they so choose when they get older, they can decide to rebel against God. They can decide to rebel against what we taught them. But I'm talking about from our responsibility as a parent. Our responsibility is to give them the right foundation. Our responsibility is to point them in the right way. Are we mindful of the things of God? Are we mindful of the things of man? And then we read on down as Jesus continues to deal with this. You know, in 24, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross and follow me. Look at 26. For what profit is it to a man if he gains the whole world and loses his own soul? Or what will a man give in exchange for his soul? Now let's think about this verse, but let's make application to parenting. And so if we were to make application to parenting, we could read it like this. For what profit is it to the parents or to the child if the child gains the whole world and loses his own soul? And what would the parents give in exchange for their child's lost soul? My child, if they could just gain a lot so that they would be confident. Now that's a whole nother study, but everything the world says about confidence is from a fleshly standpoint, and everything that God says about confidence is from a spiritual standpoint. And if you've never done a study on where we're supposed to get our confidence, I encourage you to do that so you don't lead your children astray. We're supposed to get our confidence from the very idea of who our Creator is, and that we are children of God. That's our identity. That's our confidence. But what if my child could be on honor roll? What if my child could be in first chair? What if my child can be on the starting team? What if my child gets a D1 scholarship? What if my child scores so high that they have a full ride? What if my child graduates from college with honors? My child gets the whole world. I have succeeded. But what if they lose their soul? What if my child graduates and starts out their first year out of school 6-figure salary? And what if in the early 20s they come out with the next social media invention? And before they're 30, it sells for $100 million. I've succeeded, right? Think about the times that my phone's rung or somebody stopped by the office, and it's usually a mother or father crying. And it's usually about an 18, 19, 20, 21, 22, 23-year-old child. And they'll usually begin by saying all the things their child has succeeded at. How well they've done in the sport, how well they did in college, how much money they're making. And then there'll be a but. But now they have no love for God. Now they never attend church. And the parent will start crying. And then the parent will start saying, I see some things I've done wrong. I know when they were younger, I didn't always go to church. And I know they got that example from me. Or I know we never studied Scripture together at home. It was just a Sunday thing to us. And the parent's crying, and what's interesting, in a sad way, what's interesting at that point, if you could say to that parent, if you'll just pay $100,000, what will a man give in exchange for his soul? What will a man give in exchange for his child's soul? And at that point, I think about a phone call I got not that long ago. If I could have said to that mother, just write a $100,000 check to God, I guarantee you that mother would have cashed out everything she could find, and she would have wrote that check. If you could say, from today forward, just do this, she would have done it. What would you give for your child's soul? Well, the reality is, once they've left home, there's very little you can give. But while they're at home, you can give them a lot. You can model the faith, because your children know if you're acting or if it's genuine. Your children spot hypocrisy before you even spot it. And also, you can give them an investment into their life. You can spend time in prayer and in Scripture with them. You can spend time taking them to serve with us in orphans. You can spend time with them on mission trips or whatever it may be. But the point is, once they have left childhood, you don't get a do-over, but you will find yourself saying, what would I give in exchange for my child's soul? Almost anything. But there's no buyback. So what is the ultimate destination? The ultimate destination is for our child to spend eternity with God. We're going to take a break. And after this break, we're going to start back again at birth. And we're going to look at a second destination that it's very important, and yet it's very difficult.